The lights inside WPA studios were unforgiving, bright, clinical, almost interrogative. They made the air feel warmer than it really was, despite the air conditioning humming quietly from the ceiling. The camera crew moved with silent precision, lenses adjusted, microphones checked, teleprompters loaded. Behind the stage, makeup artists dabbed at foreheads and adjusted ties with last-minute efficiency. Walter Grayson stood near the edge of the set, his silhouette backlit against the American flag and a gleaming blue and white digital screen bearing the debate title. Federal Oversight, Constitutional Crisis, or Democratic Safeguard. He looked the part, no doubt, his tailored navy suit sharp against his pale skin and silver hair, posture upright, chin high. At 72, he carried the aura of a man who had shaped the very rules everyone else now played by. To many, he had. Decades behind a microphone, years in the Reagan administration, author of 5 best-selling books and countless public appearances, had earned him nicknames like the Great Constitutional Guardian and, in more partisan circles, the Hammer. He checked his notes again, though he didn't need to. It was part of the show. A signal to the cameras, to the audience, to himself. I'm ready. Across the stage, a staffer whispered something into the earpiece of Brian Whitmore, the evening's moderator. Brian gave a small nod, then looked down at his tablet. In 2 minutes, they'd be live. Danielle Harper hadn't spoken since arriving. She stood quietly on her mark, just past her podium, adjusting the sleeves of her gray blazer. Her expression was unreadable. Calm, but not disconnected. Present, but not inviting. She wasn't new to public speaking. Years in courtrooms and congressional hearings had cured her of nerves. But there was something else she was holding back. A kind of watchful stillness, like a lioness listening from the grass. To those watching in the studio, campaign staff, press, political analysts, Danielle seemed outmatched. Walter's presence filled the room with ease. He greeted people with familiarity, shook hands with confidence, and even winked at one of the camera operators. Danielle nodded politely when addressed, but didn't linger. She hadn't come to charm anyone. She hadn't come to lose either. From his seat near the main camera, a young tech assistant leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "She looks nervous." His colleague raised an eyebrow. Or maybe just patient. The countdown began in the control room. 5, 4, 3. "Good evening, America," Brian Whitmore began as the cameras went live. "Tonight, from WPA Studios here in Arlington, Virginia, we present a special edition of American Forums, a debate on federal election oversight, its constitutionality, its limits, and its future." Brian's voice was practiced, balanced. A respected journalist with no obvious political leanings, he had moderated dozens of such events. But tonight felt different, and he knew it. This wasn't a conversation between policy wonks. This was an ideological collision. He turned slightly toward the camera. Joining us tonight are 2 distinguished guests. To my right, constitutional scholar, former Reagan advisor, and best-selling author, Mr. Walter Grayson. Walter gave a half nod, the kind politicians use when they know they're already winning. And to my left, Congresswoman Danielle Harper of Texas's 25th District, civil rights attorney, legislator, and member of the House Judiciary Committee. Danielle offered a polite smile, brief and closed-lipped. "Let's begin," Brian said, hands clasped in front of him. "Mr. Grayson, opening statement?" Walter didn't hesitate. His voice was deep and authoritative, with just the right edge of indignation. "The Constitution," he began, "is not a living document. It is not meant to change with the whims of modern politics. The proposed legislation, giving the federal government sweeping control over state-run elections, is not only unconstitutional, it's dangerous. It undermines the 10th Amendment, federalism, and centuries of legal precedent." He spoke in clipped sentences, each word sharpened like a knife, each pause calculated for dramatic effect. His fans would eat this up. Danielle listened without blinking. Her arms stayed at her sides. No note-taking, no head-shaking. She simply looked at him, calm and still. Brian nodded, then turned. "Congresswoman Harper?" Danielle exhaled softly and leaned into the microphone. Her voice was warm but steady. "The Constitution was written to ensure freedom, not to preserve inequality. We have a duty to protect access to the ballot box for all citizens, especially when state laws suppress it." She didn't speak quickly. She didn't raise her voice. And yet, there was something about her tone, a quiet confidence that didn't need performance. Walter scoffed lightly, not loud enough for the microphone, but loud enough for the front row to hear. Brian pressed forward. "Mr. Grayson, would you care to respond?" "I would, yes." Walter turned fully to face Danielle. "I hope you've brought more than good intentions to this discussion, Congresswoman. Passion doesn't override the law." A few chuckles from the conservative side of the audience. Danielle's expression didn't change. She tilted her head slightly. "I brought the truth. That usually does the trick." Walter's smile froze. Brian cleared his throat, guiding them to the next question. "Let's talk about precedent." But Walter wasn't listening anymore. His eyes stayed fixed on Danielle, studying her now. He had expected a progressive idealist, with sound bites and slogans. What he got instead was a trial attorney with patience. From the wings, a senior producer whispered to his headset, "This one's gonna trend." Walter took the opening minutes of the debate as a personal stage, his rhythm polished from years of syndicated radio. His cadence rose and fell like a preacher's, bouncing between historical references and warnings of tyranny. He quoted Hamilton, invoked Madison, and even mentioned Reagan, though no one had brought him up. It wasn't about the legislation yet. It was about power and his command of the room. Danielle let him go. She glanced briefly to her right. Her leather briefcase rested by her chair, zipped, untouched. The same one she carried to hearings, to depositions, to meetings with constituents. Inside were her notes, of course, but also something else, something heavier. Walter was still talking. "What we are seeing," he declared, finger-tapping the podium, "is an erosion of state sovereignty. The federal government cannot simply step in and say, 'We'll handle your elections for you.' That's not liberty, that's centralization." Applause erupted from a small group behind the cameras, likely interns or members of his staff. It was enough noise for Brian to pause, raise a hand, and gesture gently for quiet. Danielle didn't flinch. She waited for the room to calm. Then she leaned in. "With respect," she began, eyes on Walter, "what we're seeing is an erosion of voting rights. You're defending the power of states. Fine. But what about the power of citizens? What happens when states abuse that power to suppress the vote?" Walter opened his mouth, but Danielle kept going. "You say this is about liberty. Whose liberty? Because it seems to me the only liberties you're defending are the ones that protect power, not the ones that ensure participation." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Brian looked between them, sensing a shift in momentum. Walter chuckled. "You clearly don't understand federalism, Congresswoman." Now Danielle turned fully to face him. "I understand it just fine, Mr. Grayson. I also understand what selective outrage looks like." The words hung in the air for a second too long. Walter's lips thinned. Brian, ever the professional, cut in. "Let's pivot to specifics. Congresswoman, can you explain how this proposed legislation fits within the bounds of the Constitution?" Danielle nodded once. "Certainly. The 14th and 15th Amendments give Congress explicit authority to enforce voting rights. When states enact laws that disproportionately impact marginalized communities, the federal government is not only allowed but obligated to intervene." Walter interrupted. "The 10th Amendment clearly—" Danielle raised a hand. "We'll get to the 10th, but first let's not cherry-pick, because if we're talking about original intent, the Reconstruction Amendments were quite clear. Protect the vote." The back and forth continued, but something had shifted. Walter's voice, once smooth and dominant, had started to lose its edge. Danielle wasn't reacting the way he expected. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't losing. He went back to his old tools: mocking tone, rapid citations, and jabs at her experience. "You're quoting law professors who've never seen the inside of a courtroom," he said at one point. "I was working on constitutional issues when you were in diapers." A few scattered laughs from the right side of the audience. Danielle smiled slightly. "I'm not interested in who was working on what when. I'm interested in the consistency of the arguments, past and present." Walter's brow furrowed. Brian's tablet buzzed with a message from the control room. "Ratings spike. Don't cut early." Danielle had been taking it all in, the interruptions, the condescension, the smug retorts. She had seen this performance before, dozens of times. Not just from Walter. From judges, colleagues, political opponents who assumed calmness meant weakness, who mistook patience for inexperience. Walter launched into another lecture, this one about the framers and the dangers of judicial activism. And Danielle, once again, said nothing. Her fingers moved gently against the side of the briefcase. She let him have one more round. When he concluded, a little too loudly, with the line, "This bill is an affront to constitutional order," the room went quiet again. Danielle straightened slightly, then spoke, softly. "You've written extensively on this topic, haven't you, Mr. Grayson?" Walter smiled, relieved to return to familiar ground. "Yes, 5 books, all of which outline—" "I've read them," she said calmly. There was a moment of pause. Brian blinked. Walter nodded, pleased. "Good. Then you know—" Danielle continued, still calm. "I've read them thoroughly, cover to cover, and I look forward to discussing your interpretations, in your own words." The silence that followed was sharp, not the silence of confusion, but anticipation. From the back of the room, someone muttered, "Wait, what?" Danielle didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Not yet. Timing was everything. Brian's voice broke through. "That's a good point to pause. When we return, we'll continue with specifics of federal authority and constitutional scope." The cameras began to pan out, lights dimming slightly for the commercial break. Walter stepped back from his podium, rolling his shoulders, glancing at the control room monitors. Danielle reached down and touched the zipper of her briefcase, not opening it, just a subtle, precise motion, like a surgeon readying tools. When the screen faded to black, the last thing viewers saw was her expression. Still, ready. Walter Grayson was in his element. The moment the cameras came back from break, his tone sharpened. No more preamble. He didn't bother with a welcoming smile or a return to civility. His eyes locked onto Danielle Harper, and his words became deliberate weapons. "I want to make something absolutely clear," he said, voice rising just enough to command the studio. "This bill isn't about civil rights. It's about control. It's about the federal government inserting itself into every corner of state governance. You say you want to protect voters? What you really want is to strip power from the people who know their communities best." He didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, like a lion mid-stalk. Danielle remained motionless behind her podium, her face giving nothing away. The lights above reflected softly off her glasses. She didn't shift her weight, didn't check her notes. Walter took it as permission to continue. "This Congresswoman," he went on, gesturing toward her but never quite pointing, "has argued that the 14th and 15th Amendments grant sweeping federal authority. But she forgets one critical thing. The Constitution is not a tool for political manipulation. It's a safeguard against it." He turned slightly, addressing the room. "I've seen this kind of legal sleight of hand before. People cherry-pick amendments, quote parts of Supreme Court decisions out of context, and then pretend that qualifies as constitutional expertise. But I've been studying the Constitution longer than most of these so-called scholars have been alive. I've argued with Supreme Court justices. I've advised presidents." He pivoted back toward Danielle. "And with all due respect, Congresswoman, your resume doesn't begin to qualify you to challenge mine." Brian Whitmore shifted in his seat, unsure whether to step in. Danielle made no movement, gave no signal. Brian glanced toward the control booth. No signal there either. Let it play. Walter pressed on. Passion is not principle, he declared, and your party's obsession with federal power is not patriotism. You want a system where Washington decides everything, from voter ID laws to how ballots are counted in rural Georgia. That's not democracy, that's central planning. Danielle slowly folded her hands on the podium, her right thumb pressed gently into the side of her left hand, a gesture no one in the audience would catch. It was the same motion she used in courtrooms, just before making her first objection. Walter was still talking. I've debated law professors, sitting senators, even Supreme Court nominees, he said, his voice lifting in a proud rhythm. I've written 5 books on constitutional authority, and in every single one I've outlined why centralized control is not only inefficient, it's unconstitutional. Danielle exhaled softly through her nose. Walter's tone shifted slightly. His performance was entering its second act, the part where he went for the gut. Congresswoman Harper may mean well, he said, voice dipped in sarcasm, but she represents a dangerous trend in Washington. Young lawmakers who believe activism is a substitute for education. That energy can replace experience. He looked straight at her now. I respect your background, your intentions, even your story. But let's be honest. You're standing here with talking points. I'm standing here with decades of precedent. For the first time, Danielle's gaze sharpened, just slightly, a narrowing of the eyes, a soft breath inward. She didn't respond. Yet. Walter pressed the advantage. You speak about fairness, he said, but fairness without law is just chaos. The Constitution doesn't care about feelings. It doesn't care about trends. And it certainly doesn't care about whether someone in Congress thinks their job is to correct history. A low murmur rolled through part of the studio audience. Danielle leaned forward an inch. Are you finished, Mr. Grayson? The room quieted. Walter smiled. Not quite. He turned again toward the cameras. Let me remind everyone watching that this legislation, this so-called Voting Rights Protection Act, is nothing more than a power grab dressed in moral clothing. And it's being championed by people who either don't understand the Constitution or are actively choosing to ignore it. Danielle didn't flinch. Brian cleared his throat, eager to regain control. Congresswoman Harper, would you care to respond? She adjusted her mic slightly. Eventually, she said, voice calm, but I prefer to let someone finish digging before I take away the shovel. The line landed hard, a few chuckles, then complete silence. Walter blinked. He hadn't expected sass. He expected fire, anger, emotion. But this was unnerving. She wasn't just calm, she was deliberate. Danielle turned slightly to face him. You've had a lot to say about my credentials, she said. So let me say this. You're right. You've written 5 books. You've advised presidents. You've built a reputation so large, people stop asking if it's still accurate. Walter's face twitched. Danielle continued. I'm not here to compare resumes. I'm here to talk about what the Constitution actually says and what you've said about it. Walter stiffened. My views are well documented. I know, Danielle said. I've read them. Her words, again, deliberate, weighted. Each one carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Walter glanced toward Brian. Brian offered no rescue. Danielle straightened her back. And when the time is right, she said, eyes fixed on Walter, I'll walk you and the American people through those well-documented views, chapter by chapter, in fact. Walter's mouth tightened into a line. Danielle paused, then turned back to Brian. But for now, she said, her tone light again, I'll let Mr. Grayson finish showing us how constitutional principles sound when they're treated like political props. Brian looked stunned. Even the studio crew seemed to have frozen. Walter opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in the debate, The room belonged to Danielle Harper. Silence was not common on live television, especially not during a political debate. But as Danielle Harper reached for her briefcase, the entire studio held its breath. The zipper's soft rasp echoed louder than it should have, a simple mechanical sound amplified by tension. Cameras zoomed in instinctively, lenses drawn not by direction, but by instinct. Brian Whitmore said nothing. Walter Grayson watched her hands with growing discomfort, his mouth slightly open as if bracing for a punch. Danielle didn't rush. Her fingers moved with courtroom precision, slow and purposeful. From within the briefcase, she withdrew a worn, tabbed, heavily annotated book. The cover, red, white, and navy, was instantly familiar to anyone remotely interested in politics. The Patriot's Constitution by Walter Grayson. First published, 2013. Bestseller. Cited in Senate hearings. Quoted in conservative think tank op-eds. She laid it gently on the podium. Her hand lingered on the cover. "I'd like to begin this next part," she said softly, "by revisiting some of Mr. Grayson's previously stated positions." Walter blinked. "Excuse me?" Danielle opened the book, flipping with familiarity to a bookmarked page. Neon sticky tabs jutted from the edges like colorful thorns. "You mentioned," she said, "that the federal government has no constitutional authority to intervene in state-run elections." Walter straightened, cautious. "That's correct." Danielle didn't look up. "Yet in this book, your book, you wrote, and I quote, 'The federal government has not only the right, but the responsibility to ensure that state election systems do not disenfranchise voters, particularly when historical evidence suggests targeted suppression.'" She closed the book with a soft thump. "That's page 112. A collective murmur rippled through the audience. Brian cleared his throat. "Mr. Grayson, would you like to respond?" Walter's face tightened. "That quote is being taken out of context. That was about foreign interference." Danielle opened the book again. "Actually, it was about voter ID laws in Mississippi." She flipped to the introduction. Chapter title, "The Real Threat Isn't Foreign." Walter's jaw clenched. Danielle placed the book to the side and reached into her briefcase again. A second book appeared, The Federal Balance, 2015. This one had even more tabs. "In this one," she continued, "you wrote, and I quote, 'When state legislatures enact policies that result in disproportionate voter suppression, it becomes the moral obligation of Congress to intervene.'" That's page 87. Brian looked toward Walter. Walter tried again. "I'm sure I explained the limits of—" "You did," Danielle nodded. "On page 120, where you clarified that federal oversight is only problematic when it's not rooted in constitutional authority, which, as I stated earlier, the 14th and 15th Amendments clearly provide." The audience was utterly still. A few phones glowed as people texted or tweeted in real time. Danielle lifted her head and looked directly at Walter. "So I'm curious," she said gently. "Which Walter Grayson are we debating tonight? The one who wrote that federal intervention was a moral necessity, or the one who now calls it a tyrannical overreach?" Walter's eyes darted to Brian, then back to Danielle. "Legal perspectives evolve with circumstances." Danielle smiled faintly. "Of course, but principle shouldn't be that flexible, especially when you've built your career on consistency." Walter looked suddenly smaller, not physically, but in stature, in presence. His voice, once booming, had gone flatter. He licked his lips before speaking again. "I believe in the Constitution," he said. Danielle nodded. "Then let's keep going." She pulled out the third book. Gasps this time. American Resolve, 2018, known for its fiery defense of executive restraint and constitutional checks. Danielle didn't even open it at first. She just looked at it in her hands like it weighed more than paper. "This book was published the year after Shelby County v. Holder," she said. "The ruling gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You celebrated it as a victory for federalism." Walter leaned forward, trying to reassert himself. "It was a correction of judicial overreach." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Interesting." Because in this book, you wrote, "Though the court's ruling is legally sound, the erosion of voter protections should be met with legislative solutions to maintain democratic integrity." She opened to the page 203. Walter's hand tightened on his podium. Brian's voice cracked slightly. "Do you still agree with that statement, Mr. Grayson?" Walter didn't answer. He just looked at the book like it might catch fire. Danielle didn't press. She simply set the third book down and reached into the briefcase once more. This time she pulled out 2 books at once, Guardians of Liberty and Shadows of the Founders. 5 books, all Walter's, all marked, flagged, underlined. She spread them across her podium like evidence in court. The camera operators, sensing a television moment of rare weight, zoomed in on the titles. A graphic appeared at the bottom of the screen. Congresswoman Harper cites Walter Grayson's own works. Danielle placed her hands flat on either side of the display. "You've spent this evening dismissing me," she said, tone still measured. "You've questioned my knowledge, my preparation, my understanding of the Constitution, and you've done it with the authority of someone who's written books on the topic." Walter didn't move. "I read those books," Danielle said. "All of them, carefully. And I found inconsistencies, not over decades, but often from one chapter to the next." She picked up Shadows of the Founders. "In this one, you argue that the Founding Fathers feared central authority, and yet in the appendix, you provide a glowing endorsement of federal intervention during the Eisenhower era to enforce school desegregation. Was that also different context?" Walter's voice was low. "That was a different issue." Danielle tilted her head. "Equal rights is always the same issue." A wave of applause burst from the left side of the audience. Short, surprised, but powerful. Brian raised a hand to quiet them. Danielle turned toward the camera. "This debate was supposed to be about constitutional interpretation, but it's become something else. An exercise in exposing how political convenience can twist principle into propaganda." She paused. "And Mr. Grayson, with all due respect, I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to hold you accountable to the standards you've claimed to live by." Walter's face was flushed now, not with rage, but something closer to recognition. Danielle looked back at Brian. "I'm done for now," she said quietly, "but I have more." Walter Grayson didn't speak for nearly 30 seconds. On live television, 30 seconds was a lifetime. Danielle Harper had returned to stillness. Her briefcase now empty, its contents spread in front of her like tools on an operating table. 5 books, all his, each one highlighted, annotated, cross-referenced. She had introduced the audience not just to contradictions, but to a methodology. Painstaking, deliberate, and devastatingly thorough. Walter shifted in his spot. He cleared his throat. He glanced at Brian Whitmore, who, perhaps wisely, offered no lifeline. Instead, Brian looked at the clock and then to the camera. "We'll continue our discussion now with follow-ups," he said, trying to reclaim some rhythm. "Congresswoman Harper, is there a particular theme you're trying to establish with these citations?" Danielle nodded. "Yes, a pattern." She picked up American Resolve again, flipping directly to a tabbed page. Her hands were steady. Her eyes remained locked on the text. "Page 146, she said. Quote, "The founders intended for the federal government to remain small, but even they recognized the necessity of intervention when states violated the liberties of individuals." She closed the book and looked up. "That statement was made in defense of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You used it to justify federal involvement in desegregation. Yet tonight, you argue that similar federal oversight, this time for voting rights, is unconstitutional." Walter's lips moved, but the microphone picked up no sound. Danielle didn't stop. She lifted the federal balance. "In this book, you write about the importance of consistent constitutional interpretation. You argue that changing legal positions based on which political party is in power undermines public trust." Walter finally found his voice. I stand by that. Danielle nodded. Good. Then help me understand how, in 2015, with a Republican administration, you praised federal oversight, and in 2023, with a Democratic one, you call it tyranny. The studio was so silent that the sound of someone shifting in their chair could be heard through the boom mic. Walter leaned forward. The context matters. Danielle raised a brow. Context always matters. But what doesn't change, what shouldn't change, is principle. She stepped out slightly from behind her podium, still holding the book. You told your readers that constitutional consistency was the mark of a true scholar. That was your phrase. She flipped to another page. Page 202. Those who change their legal arguments to suit the political winds are not constitutional scholars. They are charlatans, cloaked in patriotism. Walter's shoulders visibly dropped. Brian leaned forward, voice gentle. Mr. Grayson? Walter exhaled slowly. He paused. I wrote those things, yes, and I believe the core of my arguments still hold, even if the framing has changed. Danielle tilted her head. Framing isn't the problem. Framing is marketing. This is about the foundation of your argument, the core legal position. And the truth is, that position changes when it's convenient. She didn't say it angrily. She said it like a teacher correcting a student. Calm, measured. Disappointing, not enraged, Walter looked down at the podium. Danielle took a moment before continuing. I've spent my career fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. I've stood in courtrooms across Texas defending clients who were told they didn't have a right to vote or to speak or to simply exist peacefully. When I came to Congress, I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, not when it was easy, not when it was popular, but always. She placed the book back on the table. You built a legacy on that same oath, but somewhere along the line, that legacy stopped being about the law and started being about your brand. The comment landed harder than any accusation could have. Walter's brand, his identity, had been his shield for decades. And now it was a liability. Brian looked between them. Let's pause here for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground. But Danielle lifted a hand. One more. She reached under her papers and pulled out a single sheet of printer paper. No book this time, just a printed page with a bolded header. Op-ed, Walter Grayson, The National Tribune, August 2019. Danielle read, Federal courts have a duty to strike down state laws that violate constitutional principles, even if those laws are politically popular. The rights of the minority must never be subject to the whims of the majority. She set the paper down. You wrote that in defense of a lawsuit challenging California's gun restrictions, she said. So I ask again, why are voting rights any different? Walter swallowed hard. Danielle leaned slightly forward. The truth is, they're not. What's different is who's in charge. And that, Mr. Grayson, is the problem. The camera caught his expression in perfect focus. Blank, stunned, no defiance left. Brian waited a beat before turning to the audience. We'll take a short break. When we return, final thoughts from both participants. As the screen faded to black, the studio erupted in low, hushed conversation. Journalists typed furiously. Producers scrambled to clip the last 10 minutes for social media. Phones buzzed in every pocket. Danielle turned away from the camera and calmly began organizing her notes. No gloating, no triumphant smile, just quiet efficiency. Walter remained frozen at his podium, staring at his own name on the covers spread before him. The break wasn't long enough for him to collect himself, but it was long enough for the internet to catch fire. When the cameras returned from the commercial break, the mood in the studio had changed. Something invisible had shifted, not just in the energy, but in the expectations. Viewers at home weren't waiting to hear a debate anymore. They were waiting to witness a reckoning. Brian Whitmore sat forward slightly in his chair. We now return to our final round of discussion. Congresswoman Harper, Mr. Grayson, this segment will focus on concluding thoughts, but if either of you would like to clarify anything from earlier, now is the time. Danielle didn't move. She simply looked to Walter. Brian followed her gaze. Mr. Grayson? Walter took a breath that sounded shaky even through his mic. He didn't look up right away, just stared at the books lined up on Danielle's podium like they were court exhibits in a trial he hadn't known he was on trial for. I've spent 40 years defending the Constitution, he began, voice quieter than expected. I've written thousands of pages, lectured in universities, hosted thousands of hours of discussion. He finally looked at Danielle. And in all those years, I've never had anyone lay out my contradictions the way you just did. He tried to smile, but it collapsed halfway. Your team did their homework. Danielle didn't flinch. I did my homework. Walter nodded once. Yes, you did. A pause. Then, I still believe federal overreach is a danger to liberty, but it's fair to say I haven't always been consistent in how I've applied that belief. It was the closest thing to an admission anyone had ever heard from him. No apology, but no denial either. Danielle tilted her head. Would you agree, then, that constitutional interpretation shouldn't shift based on political affiliation? Walter hesitated. Yes. Danielle stepped forward, not in aggression, but in clarity. Then I need to say something clearly, because millions of Americans have read your books. They've watched your show. They've built their understanding of law based on your words. When your words shift with the political tide, it doesn't just confuse the discourse, it erodes trust in the Constitution itself. Walter looked away. He had no response. Brian tried to move on, but Danielle wasn't done. Let me tell you why I came tonight, she said, voice rising just slightly. I didn't come here to win a debate. I didn't come to prove I'm smarter than Walter Grayson. I came because the people I represent are tired. They're tired of being told their vote doesn't matter. They're tired of having to fight for rights their parents already won. They're tired of hearing constitutional arguments used as weapons to maintain the status quo. She placed both hands on the podium. And they're tired of people with power pretending that consistency is optional. A murmur rippled through the audience. Walter opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Danielle continued. You've spent decades telling the public that liberty comes from limiting the federal government. But what you don't say is that liberty also comes from protection, from federal guardrails that keep states from rolling back progress. She paused, then added, It's not one or the other, it's both. And the Constitution, when interpreted honestly, supports that balance. Walter lowered his gaze again. Brian, sensing the moment, turned to him one last time. Mr. Grayson, would you like to offer any final response? Walter looked up. His voice was hoarse. I think I've said enough tonight. Danielle gave a small nod, not triumphant, just resolute. Brian turned to the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this evening's debate, one that will no doubt be discussed for years to come. As the outro music began to play, the camera slowly zoomed out. But the world was already zooming in. Within minutes, clips flooded social media. Not just one or two viral moments, but the entire 20-minute takedown was chopped, stitched, captioned, and shared across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit. Headlines followed within the hour. CNN breaking. Danielle Harper dismantles conservative icon with his own books. The Atlantic. Grayson's fall. How a debate shattered a brand. The Guardian. The moment the Constitution fought back. By morning, the phrase Graysoned trended globally, used to describe any public figure exposed using their own words. Even Grayson's most loyal followers were confused. Some were angry, others betrayed. A few clung to explanations like context. But it was hard to explain away 5 books, dozens of quotes, and a congresswoman who had read them all cover to cover. The clip of Danielle saying, "I did my homework," became a rallying cry on political TikTok. Progressive influencers praised her as the new AOC but with case law. Law students made memes. College professors assigned the debate as homework. Fox News tried to spin it as selective quoting, but even their panelists couldn't agree. One former GOP strategist said quietly, "We underestimated her. Big mistake." And Walter? His next show opened with no music, just silence. He began with, "Last night didn't go as I expected." It was the understatement of his career. Stations pulled ads, publishers postponed a book release, 2 think tanks removed him from advisory roles, and for the first time since he rose to prominence, Walter Grayson went silent on Twitter. Danielle Harper, meanwhile, was booked solid for the next month. MSNBC, The Daily Show, NPR, Late Night with Colbert. But in each appearance, she said the same thing. "This wasn't about me. It was about accountability." When asked how she'd prepared, she gave a 1-sentence answer. "I treated him like a witness in a deposition." 3 hours after the broadcast ended, Haj Grayson was the #1 trending hashtag in the United States. By sunrise, it was trending worldwide. The takedown had been so methodical, so surgical, that even people who hadn't watched the debate were now intimately familiar with its highlights. Clips of Danielle Harper flipping through Walter Grayson's own books played on loop across social media. YouTube compilations had titles like How to End a Political Career in 5 Books, Receipts, Rhetoric, Danielle Harper's Masterclass, The Moment Grayson Knew He Was Done. Conservative pundits scrambled. The usual firewalls, media bias, liberal editing, out-of-context clips, crumbled under the weight of raw footage. There was no spin that could undo the image of Grayson standing silent as Harper read his own words back to him. Fox News tried. The morning after, they ran a segment titled When Preparation Becomes Ambush, but even their hosts looked unsure. On the liberal side, it was jubilation. MSNBC played the quote, "I did my homework," every hour. Joy Reid called it the most important political moment of the year. By noon, Harper's office had received more than 10,000 media requests. Her Twitter following tripled in 24 hours. Campaign donations surged past $2, $5 million by the end of the week. Her name started appearing in op-eds next to phrases like rising star, future speaker, and presidential potential. But it wasn't just politics that changed. In academia, law schools pounced. Harvard Law added a module to its constitutional interpretation course titled The Harper Method, using primary sources to hold power accountable. Yale Law invited her for a guest lecture. Georgetown asked her to keynote its legal ethics conference. Legal blogs exploded with analysis. One professor tweeted, "What Harper did wasn't just rhetorical, it was forensic litigation applied to political discourse. She weaponized precedent." A new term started circulating in legal circles, forensic debate. In media cable news, debates changed overnight. Producers began demanding source documentation from guests. New show formats emerged, segments where guests were presented with their own past quotes live on air, forcing real-time reconciliation. CNN launched a special series called Consistency Check, inspired by Harper's performance. The premiere episode opened with Danielle's voice, reading from Grayson's book. Satire shows had a field day. SNL debuted a sketch called Homework Wars, featuring a fictional congresswoman slapping down pundits with binders full of tabs. The cultural impact was immediate and deep. For Walter Grayson, the fall was brutal. In the weeks that followed, his radio show lost 3 national advertisers. His book sales plummeted by 70%. 2 major universities disinvited him from speaking engagements. His podcast was paused indefinitely. But the worst part wasn't external. It was internal. The very audience that once praised him for destroying liberals now questioned his credibility. Message boards that used to celebrate his every word filled with threads like, "Did Grayson lie to us? How can we trust him now?" Harper made him look like a fraud. Grayson tried damage control. He posted a video statement. What happened was a coordinated attempt to discredit decades of my work, but cherry-picking doesn't erase the truth. But the comments were brutal. One of the top replies, "She didn't cherry-pick. She read entire paragraphs from your own books." Eventually, his publisher pulled out of a planned 6th book. The title, The Integrity of the Constitution. In Washington, Capitol Hill took notice. Progressive lawmakers rallied around Harper. Representative Maxwell Frost tweeted, "That was a generational moment. Danielle Harper just rewrote the rules of engagement." Even centrist Democrats, usually cautious about confrontation, praised her strategy. Behind the scenes, Republican staffers began frantically reviewing their own boss's published work, worried about being Harpered next. One congressman reportedly told his aide, "Scrub everything I said about states' rights from 2012. I'm not getting bindered on CNN." In committees, things shifted. When Harper spoke, people listened, not because she was loud, but because she came armed with receipts. And while other politicians posed for the cameras, she was back in her office, reading. Public reaction. The debate sparked a national conversation about intellectual honesty. Talk shows, podcasts, classrooms, even churches held discussions about the Harper effect. One preacher in Atlanta said during Sunday service, "Truth is powerful, but truth with preparation, that's divine." High school civics teachers played the debate in class. College students joked about carrying around Grayson kits, 5 books and a highlighter. Memes flooded the internet. Danielle Harper holding books like swords. Walter Grayson labeled as, "When your receipts don't receipt." A popular TikTok trend used audio from the debate with teens lip-syncing, "I actually read all your books." Even international outlets picked it up. BBC ran a feature, How a U.S. Congresswoman Used a Conservative's Words to End His Reign. Danielle's next move. It didn't take long. Penguin Random House offered her a 7-figure book deal. The title? Receipts. How to Hold the Powerful Accountable with Their Own Words. It sold out pre-orders in 48 hours. She announced a national book tour, not just to promote the book, but to hold workshops for young political staffers, students, and activists on how to build arguments grounded in fact, not spin. "I want to teach people how to research with precision," she said on Morning Joe, because in an age of information overload, credibility is the real power. 6 months after the debate that reshaped American political discourse, the ripple effects had not only endured, they had grown. What happened on that CNN stage didn't just expose one man's inconsistencies. It set off a chain reaction that forced an entire political ecosystem to confront something it had long evaded: accountability through documentation. And at the center of it stood Danielle Harper. A new political template. They called it the Harper Standard. Campaign consultants, media trainers, and political strategists rewrote debate prep protocols. No longer was it enough to have talking points. You had to come equipped with published works by your opponent, archived interviews, legislation they supported or opposed under different administrations. Opposition research, once focused on scandal and sound bites, now became an exercise in forensic documentation. One DCCC strategist summarized it best: "We don't prep candidates anymore. We arm them like lawyers preparing for deposition." The RNC scrambled to catch up. An internal memo leaked to Politico read, "We are vulnerable to harpering. All public-facing candidates must undergo retroactive consistency review." The academic impact universities turned the Grayson-Harper debate into curriculum. Harvard's Kennedy School offered a course titled Preparation as Power: The Harper Doctrine in Political Debate. Georgetown's law program included a capstone simulation. Students were given a fictional political opponent, tasked with sourcing 10-plus contradictions from their published work, and preparing a live rebuttal strategy. Legal journals began citing Danielle Harper in papers on rhetorical ethics, integrity-based advocacy, and adversarial consistency. One Georgetown professor put it bluntly, "We used to ask, what's persuasive? Now we ask, What's verifiable? Media, from sound bites to sourcebooks. Major media outlets adjusted editorial policies. CNN launched a recurring series, Words vs. Words, comparing public figures' past statements to current claims. The Washington Post created a new feature called Flip Tracker, documenting ideological reversals across political careers. PBS debuted a monthly segment, The Receipts Report. The effect? A measurable drop in rhetorical ambiguity. Politicians learned, if you say it, it's on record, and it will come back. Cultural shift. In everyday culture, the Harper Grayson moment became legend. TikTok creators coined a term for fact-based takedowns, getting receipted. Urban Dictionary updated its definition of Graysoned to be publicly dismantled using your own previously stated words, typically by someone who did their homework. Teenagers quoted Danielle Harper in debate clubs. Civil rights groups added her clips to leadership training. And in homes across the country, people talked not just about who was loudest, but who was right and who could prove it. Harper's book, A Manifesto for a New Era. Her bestseller, Receipts: How to Hold the Powerful Accountable with Their Own Words, became more than a book. It became a handbook. Inside were chapters on how to build a digital contradiction archive, analyzing speeches and books for ideological inconsistencies, strategies for confronting power calmly, surgically, and irrefutably. Every Democratic campaign in 2026 owned at least one copy. Some Republicans quietly bought it too. Harper didn't just destroy a political legend. She created a blueprint. Walter Grayson, The Echo of Silence. He never recovered. After a brief return to radio, met with ridicule and dwindling ratings, Grayson announced his retirement to focus on writing. But there was no book, no tour, just occasional appearances in think pieces titled The Fall of an Icon, The Risk of Believing Your Own Myth, Consistency, The Grayson Lesson. His former allies moved on. His legacy now served more as a warning than an inspiration. Danielle Harper, Beyond the Moment. Danielle Harper didn't try to go viral again. She didn't chase the spotlight. Instead, she doubled down on what made her effective: discipline. She chaired 2 subcommittees on election integrity, introduced a bill mandating citation review for expert testimonies during congressional hearings, and quietly began mentoring a new class of Black women lawyers entering politics. When asked in an interview whether she was planning a Senate run, she simply said, "I'm planning to out-research everyone who steps in my way. That strategy's working so far." The broader legacy. Most political moments fade. This one didn't, because Danielle Harper didn't just defeat Walter Grayson. She changed how political knowledge is wielded. She proved that preparation is more powerful than performance, that facts, when armed with receipts, are unbeatable, and that in an era of opinion overload, truth with proof wins. In one final interview for 60 Minutes, the host asked, "If you could sum up what that night meant for you, what would you say?" Danielle paused, then replied, "It wasn't about me. It was about proving something simple, that the Constitution doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to those who respect it enough to study it and hold others accountable to it, even if those others wrote the book on it." Sometimes, the quietest voices leave the deepest echoes. Long after the lights dimmed and the studio emptied, what lingered wasn't the applause or the headlines, but the stillness in Walter Grayson's eyes and the steady grace with which Danielle Harper turned the tide. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't vengeance. It was a reminder, one long overdue, that truth doesn't shout. It waits. Danielle Harper didn't come to the stage to win an argument. She came carrying the weight of her community, the stories of clients dismissed in courtrooms, voters turned away, students overlooked. Her preparation wasn't just intellectual, it was ancestral, and in front of a nation, She showed that integrity, backed by diligence, could still break through noise and bluster. She didn't need to raise her voice. The receipts did that for her. The Black community has always understood the cost of being underestimated. For generations, they've had to work twice as hard just to be heard, to be seen, to be believed. What Danielle Harper gave the Black community that night wasn't just vindication, it was visibility. She showed a nation that composure is not weakness, and that knowledge, when rooted in lived experience, is a force far stronger than outrage. There's a lesson here, tucked gently between the pages of every book she held up. Never mistake silence for ignorance or humility for lack of power. In a world addicted to immediacy, it was the slow, deliberate turning of a page that changed everything. Truth, it turns out, has bookmarks. Harper's confrontation wasn't just about contradiction. It was about consistency of values. She stood in the face of someone who had mocked her intelligence, dismissed her experience, and weaponized his reputation. Yet she never retaliated with the same venom. Instead, she brought light into the dark, calmly, thoroughly, and without apology. And that's the deeper message here. Hold your ground with grace. Defend your truth with care. And when the moment comes, be ready, not to destroy, but to reveal. Like a porch light left on for a family member returning late, sometimes justice is as quiet and steady as a woman pulling a book from her bag. It doesn't shout. It shows up. It waits until it's needed. And then it shines. So tonight, take a moment. Think about the people in your life who've been overlooked or underestimated. Think about the young woman in your own community, maybe someone from the Black community, who just needs someone to believe in her long enough for her light to reach the room. If this story touched something in you, consider sharing it, not for the drama, but for the dignity, because sometimes a small spark of truth in the right hands can light up an entire room, and maybe, just maybe, change everything.